All right. We have actually now done examples of change in consideration. We have done change in consideration. We have done an example for an increase in lease term as well. All right. We did an example of illustration 36 where the consideration changed from 1 lakh to 95,000. We also did illustration number 34 where the lease term got extended by a period of 4 years. Changed from 10 years to 14 years. We also did an example of a decrease in scope of asset. All right, let us actually draft our own example for a decrease in lease term. Let us actually draft our own example for a decrease in lease term. The accounting is going to be the same as decrease in scope of lease. All right, the accounting that we are going to learn is exactly the same as decrease in scope of lease, but let us actually draft our own example and see how the accounting is actually going to be. All right, let's now look at the example. We have a lease term of 10 years. Let us assume that the lease payment is 1,80,000 per annum. The incremental borrowing rate is 10 percentage per annum. At the beginning of year 6, which is 5 years have passed by, 5 years have passed by. At the beginning of year 6, the lease term is reduced from 10 years to 8 years. The lease term is reduced from 10 years to 8 years, which means we have a remaining lease term of 3 years. The remaining lease term is actually going to be 3 years, years 6, 7, and 8. The lease payments continue to remain at 1,80,000 per annum. The payment was 1,80,000 per annum earlier also. Now also we're going to have 1,80,000 per annum. The only difference is we are now not going to pay this 1,80,000 for year 9 and year 10. As a result of modification, we are reducing the lease term by 2 years, and I have the incremental borrowing rate of 11 percentage on the date of modification. At the beginning of year 6, the incremental borrowing rate is 11 percentage. Let us see how we are actually going to account for this modification. Exactly similar to the previous illustrations, we will first calculate the ROU asset and lease liability as at the date of commencement of lease. After that, we will calculate the carrying amount of ROU asset and lease liability at the beginning of year 6. All right, we'll calculate the carrying amount of ROU and lease liability at the beginning of year 6, and then we will actually do two parts accounting for modification. Part A, where we will actually derecognize right of use asset and lease liability. Part B is where we will calculate the revised lease liability. All right, so let's start with accounting. So we will actually have lease liability at the date of commencement. Lease liability at date of commencement will be calculated. We have got years, which we'll have as 1 to 10 because it's a 10-year lease. We'll have cash flow, which is equal to 1,80,000. I have present value annuity factor that I will actually calculate at 10 percentage. All right, 10% is the incremental borrowing rate on the date of commencement of lease. So I will calculate the present value annuity factor at 10 percentage. That is going to be equal to 6.1446. All right, it's going to be 6.1446. I then have discounted cash flow, which is going to be 1,80,000 multiplied by 6.1446. That is going to be equal to 11,06,028. All right, so on the date of commencement of lease, I am going to recognize a right of use asset and a lease liability of 11,06,028. All right, ROU asset and lease liability will be recognized to the tune of 11,06,028. Now we will calculate the carrying amount of ROU asset at beginning of year 6. Carrying amount of ROU asset at beginning of year 6. Beginning of year 6, remember, is end of year 5. That will be calculated as 11,06,028. This is the amount at which I recognize the ROU asset. I then reduce depreciation for a period of 5 years. See, if 5 years have elapsed by, and therefore I'm calculating the carrying amount at the beginning of year 6. So that will be 11,06,028 divided by 10. This gives me the depreciation per annum multiplied by 5 will give me the depreciation for a period of 5 years, and this carrying amount is going to be equal to 5,53,014. All right, so the carrying amount of ROU asset at the beginning of year 6 is 5,53,014. I then have to calculate the carrying amount of the lease liability at the beginning of year 6. All right, I have to calculate the carrying amount of lease liability at beginning of year 6. To calculate the amount of lease liability at the beginning of year 6, I need to draw the lease liability schedule. I need to draw the lease liability schedule where I calculate interest for every year and I deduct payments for each year. All right, so let me plot the lease liability schedule. The lease liability schedule will have the usual columns that we always have, which is years. We have the opening balance. We then have interest, which will be calculated at 10 percentage, because the discount rate that I used is 10 percentage as at the date of commencement of lease. So the discount rate will be 10 percentage. I then have payments, and I finally have closing balance. All right, starting with year one. At year one, the opening balance would be equal to the amount of lease liability that we originally recognized, which is 11 lakh 6,028. All right, I recognize the lease liability of 11 lakh 6,028. So that becomes my beginning balance for year one. I recognize interest. Interest for first year will be 10 percentage of 11 lakh 6,000. So that will be 1 lakh 10,603. All right, I'm rounding it off. It's 602.8. I'm rounding it off for the sake of convenience. So that is going to be 11 lakh 6,028 multiplied by 10 percentage, which is 1 lakh 10,603. I have payment for the first year of 1 lakh 80,000 that will be paid at the end of the year. All right, let's assume that payments are made at the end of the year. I've not clarified that in the question, but let's assume that it's made at the end of year. So that will give me a closing balance of 10 lakh 36,631. All right, it's 10 lakh 36,631. This becomes the beginning balance for the second year. The closing balance for the first year will become the beginning balance for the second year. I have interest at 10 percentage, which will be equal to 1 lakh 3,663. 10 percentage of the beginning balance, that is 1 lakh 3,663. I have a payment of 1 lakh 80,000, and the closing balance will be 10 lakh 36,631 plus 1 lakh 3,663 less 1 lakh 80,000, which is equal to 9 lakh 60,294. For year 3, the beginning balance will become 9,60,294. The interest, which is calculated at 10 percentage, will be 96,029. All right, it will be 96,029. I have a payment again of 1,80,000, and the closing balance will be 960,294 plus 96,029 less 1,80,000, which is equal to 8,76,323. For year 4, again, my beginning balance will be 8,76,323. 10 percentage of that will be 87,632. I then have payment of 1,80,000. All right, and then that gives me a closing balance of 876,323 plus 87,632 less 1,80,000, which is equal to 7,83,955. This is the closing balance at the end of year 4. At the end of for year 5, the beginning balance will be 7,83,955. The closing balance of year 4 becomes the beginning balance of year 5, and interest will be 10% of this amount, which is 78,396. I then deduct payment of 1,80,000 to calculate my lease liability, which will be 783,955 plus 78,396 less 1,80,000, which is equal to 6,82,351. All right, this is my closing lease liability as at the end of year 5. The closing lease liability at the end of year 5 is going to be the beginning lease liability of year 6, which is 682,351. At the beginning of year 6 is when I actually undergo a modification to the contract. All right, at the beginning of year 6, the lessee and the lessor are actually modifying the lease contract. All right, so our objective over here was to calculate the carrying amount at the beginning of year 6. The carrying amount of the lease liability at the beginning of year 6 is 6,82,351. It's 682,351. ROU asset was 5,53,014. Lease liability was 6,82,351. Now, at this stage, I would actually like to show you something. All right. At the end of year 5, we saw that the closing balance of the lease liability is 6,82,351. How did we calculate this? We calculated it using the lease liability schedule, wherein we had the opening balance. We then calculated interest for every year. We deducted the payments to calculate the closing balance. All right. We did that for 5 years, and at the end of fifth year, we saw that this actual balance is equal to 6,82,351. There is also another way of calculating this. This 6,82,351 at the end of year 5 would basically represent the present value of the remaining lease payments discounted at the original rate of 10 percentage. All right, you can recalculate the 6,82,000 as the present value of the remaining lease payments of 1,80,000 discounted at the rate of 10 percentage. It would actually give you 6,82,000. Remaining lease term is 5 years. You have year 6, year 7, year 8, and year 9 and year 10. All right, so for 5 years, you actually discount 1,80,000 at 10 percentage. You will actually again get 6,82,351. Should we actually just quickly give it a try? So I am plotting down years. Remember, you're actually now standing at the end of year 5. You're standing at the end of year 5 or at the beginning of year 6, right? So now you have 5 payments that are left to be made. All right, you have payment for year 6 that is going to be made. You'll have payment for year 6. This payment for year 6 is standing 1 year away from today. You're standing at the end of year 5. Payment for year 6 is basically 1 year away from today. All right, so you then have payment for year 7, which is basically 2 years away from today. You have payment for year 8, which is 3 years away from today. You then have payment for year 9, which is 4 years away from today. And then you have payment for year 10, which is 5 years away from today. All right, so we have year 6 to year 10 payments, which are standing 1 to 5 years away from today. The cash flow is going to be 1,80,000. The cash flow is going to be 1,80,000 every year. Yes, this is an annuity cash flow. I could have shown it as an annuity cash flow also, but I'm intentionally writing it as 1,80,000 in each year. We then have present value factor at 10 percentage. We have present value factor at 10 percentage. Remember, this payment for year 6 is only 1 year away from today. So the present value factor will actually be 0.9091. All right, I'm standing at the end of year 5 or beginning of year 6. This payment for year 6 is standing only 1 year away from today. So the present value factor will be 0.9091. For the year 2, it will be 0.8264, 0.7513, 0.6830. And for the last year, it will be 1 divided by 1.1 whole power 5, which is going to be equal to 6.6209. All right, we then have discounted cash flows. Discounted cash flow will be the product of cash flow and present value factor. So for the first year, it's 1,80,000 multiplied by 0.9091, which is 1,63,638. For the next year, it will be 1,80,000 multiplied by 0.8264, which is 148,752. For the third year, it's 1,80,000 multiplied by 0.7513, which is 135,234. For the fourth year, it's 1,80,000 multiplied by 0.683, which is 122,940. And for the fifth year, it's 1,80,000 multiplied by 0.6209, which is 1,11,762. It's 1,11,762. If you take the sum total of all this, it's 163,638 plus 148,752 plus 135,234 plus 122,940 plus 111,762, which is equal to 6,82,326. Remember, we had almost the same value. All right, there's a small rounding difference. I had a value of 6,82,351 that I calculated using the lease liability schedule. If I take the present value of the remaining lease payments discounted at the original rate itself, I get the same value of 6,82,326 with a marginal difference on account of rounding. All right, so the lease liability as at the end of any period, not only at the end of year 5, you take end of year 4 or end of year 3, it will actually be equal to the present value of the remaining lease payments discounted at the original discount rate. All right, so end of year 5, it will be the present value of the lease payments for year 6 to 10 discounted at 10 percentage. We're going to actually have 6,82,326. Now, if you recall the remaining lease term before modification, was equal to 5 years. All right. Out of the total term of 10 years, 5 years have passed by and I had a remaining lease term of 5 years before modification. Now the remaining lease term after modification, because of the modification, the total term reduced from 10 years to 8 years. Therefore, the remaining lease term will reduce from 5 years to 3 years. The remaining lease term is going to reduce by 2 years. It's reducing from 5 to 3. So the remaining lease term is reducing by 2 years. If I calculate the percentage reduction in remaining lease term, the percentage reduction in remaining lease term, the remaining lease term reduced by 2 years, therefore the percentage reduction is going to be 2 divided by 5 multiplied by 100, which is equal to 40 percentage. All right, I'm calculating the percentage reduction in the remaining lease term. Remember, I'm calculating it as a percentage of the remaining lease term, not as a percentage of the total lease term. All right, I'm not doing 2 divided by 10 years, which was the total lease term. I'm calculating it as a percentage of the remaining lease term. So my remaining lease term has reduced by 40 percentage. It is reduced from 5 to 3, which means it reduced by 40 percentage. Now, we are similar to the previous example. We will be derecognizing ROU asset by 40 percentage. In the previous example, we actually saw that ROU asset and lease liability are being derecognized by 50 percentage. Here we are going to derecognize ROU asset first by 40 percentage. All right. Therefore, ROU asset derecognition is going to be equal to the current carrying amount. What is the current carrying amount? At the beginning of year 6, it is 5,53,014. All right. So it will be derecognized by 5,53,014 multiplied by 40 percentage. That is going to be equal to 553,014 multiplied by 40 percentage is 2,21,206. All right. So ROU asset will be derecognized to the tune of 2,21,206. And I will have an amount of ROU asset after derecognition, after 40% derecognition, the carrying amount is going to be equal to the carrying amount of ROU asset after 40% derecognition will be 5,53,014, 5,53,014 less 2,21,206. It's 5,53,014 less 2,21,206, which is going to be equal to 3,31,808. It's 3,31,808. This is the carrying amount of the ROU asset after 40% derecognition. No, just like how we actually calculated the ROU derecognition as 5,53,000 multiplied by 40 percentage, can we also calculate the lease liability derecognition as 6,82,000 multiplied by 40 percentage? The answer is no. In the previous illustration, we actually did it that way, where we took the carrying amount of lease liability multiplied by 50 percentage. But we actually cannot do the same in this case. We cannot calculate the lease liability derecognition amount as 6,82,351 multiplied by 40 percentage. That is not allowed. This is a slight difference between decrease in the scope of lease and decrease in lease term. All right, there's a small difference between decrease in scope of lease and decrease in lease term in this aspect. Now, before we actually get into why we can't do 682 multiplied by 40 percentage, let us actually see how to calculate the amount of derecognition of lease liability. All right, let's see how do we calculate the amount of derecognition of lease liability. We calculated the amount of derecognition of ROU as 2,21,206. We have to now calculate the amount of derecognition of lease liability. Remember, I told you that this 6,82,000 is actually nothing but the present value of the lease payments for years 6 to 10. All right. We actually saw that this 6,82,000 is nothing but the present value of the future lease payments, which is lease payments from year 6 to year 10 discounted at 10 percentage. All right, we actually saw that it's nothing but the present value of the future lease payments discounted at the 10 percentage discount rate. Let's see where that working was. So we actually saw where that 682 can be calculated as the present value of 1,80,000 discounted at 10 percentage for the next 5 years. Now, as a result of the reduction in lease term, from 10 years, it's reducing to 8 years. As a result of such reduction, I am actually no longer going to pay these to 1,80,000. I will no longer be paying the pay lease rental for year 9 and year 10. All right. So I am no longer going to pay 1,80,000 at year 9 and 1,80,000 for year 10. All right. So the derecognition amount is actually going to get calculated as the sum total of these two amounts. It's all right. What I'm actually going to do is this 6,82,000 includes 122 and 1,11,000, which represent payments for year 9 and 10. What I'm going to do is I am going to derecognize 1,22,000 and 1,11,000 from the 6,82,000 carrying amount. All right, from this carrying amount of 6,82,000, I will be derecognizing the present value of 1,80,000 that is payable for year 9 and 10, because as a result of this modification, I now no longer have to pay that 1,80,000. All right, so now I'm going to derecognize the present value of the 1,80,000 which was required to be paid at the end of year 4 and year 5, or year 9 and 10 to be specific. All right, so the derecognition amount is going to be equal to 122,940 plus 1,11,762. All right, that is going to be equal to 122,940 plus 1,11,762, which is equal to 2,34,702. The derecognition amount of lease liability will be 2,34,702. Now we were able to calculate this 234 as the sum total of these two numbers. But if you actually didn't have this working with you, what you would do is you would prepare a separate working where you would actually calculate the 1,80,000 present value for year 9 and 10. All right, whatever is standing for year 9 and 10, you will discount it to today's terms. To today's terms basically means end of year 5 or beginning of year 6, and you will actually calculate this 122 and 1,11,000 separately as a working note. All right, in my case, I actually had this working to show it to you. But if you actually don't have this working, obviously, because you won't prepare this in the examination hall, what you would do is you would calculate the present value of 1,80,000, which is going to be payable for year 9 and 10. You discount it to today's terms, and that will be the derecognition amount. You now no longer have to pay this 2,34,000. Therefore, your derecognition amount is going to be equal to 2,34,702. All right, this is the slight difference. This is the slight difference between decrease in lease term and decrease in the scope of lease. In decrease in scope of lease, we were directly able to do multiplied by 50 percentage, whereas over here we are not doing multiplied by 40 percentage. We are calculating the lease payments that are no longer required to be paid in present value terms, and we are actually taking that value as the amount of derecognition. All right, so therefore, the derecognition of lease liability is equal to 2,34,000. What was it? 2,34,702. All right. So the lease liability is going to be derecognized by 2,34,702. Now, the carrying amount of lease liability at the beginning of year 6 was 682,351. It was 682,351. After derecognition of lease liability of 234,72, the carrying amount of lease liability after derecognition is going to be equal to, it's going to be 682,351 less 234,702 less 234,702, that is going to be equal to 4,47,649. All right, it's going to be 4,47,649. This is the carrying amount of the lease liability after derecognition. All right, this 4,47,649, if you actually notice, this 447,649 is going to be nothing but the present value of the lease payments for the first 3-year cash flows. All right, out of the total 6,82,000, you derecognize the cash flows of year 9 and 10. What will be left will be the cash flows for year 6, 7, and 8. All right, if you take the sum of 163, 638 plus 148, 752 plus 135, 234, that is going to be equal to, the sum total of this is going to be 4,47,620 4. This 4,47,624 is itself the same value that we got, 4,47,649. All right. So if I have to rewrite this, this basically represents the present value of the lease payments for year 6 to year 8. All right. This represents for the remaining 3 years, discounted at what rate? At 10 percentage only, which is the original rate. This 4,47,649 represents the present value of the original lease payments for year 6 to 8, discounted at 10 percentage. All right, it represents the present value of the payments for the next 3 years at 10% discount rate. Therefore, we now have the derecognition entry. We have the derecognition entry as lease liability debit of 2,34,702. We have credit ROU asset. We have two ROU asset. We credit it by 2,21,206. ROU asset we credited by 2,21,206, and we have a differential amount of gain on derecognition. We have a gain on derecognition which is going to be equal to the difference of the two, which is 234,702 less 221,206, that is equal to 13,496. All right. The difference in this example versus the previous example is that for lease liability, we did not do carrying amount multiplied by 40 percentage. We did not do carrying amount multiplied by 40 percentage. We calculated out of the 6,82,000, we are no longer required to make a payment of 1,80,000 for year 9 and 10. Therefore, we removed it out. We stripped it out from the 6,82,000 and calculated the remaining lease liability as 4,47,649. This 4,47,649 was nothing but the present value of the lease payments for the next 3 years, year 6, year 7, and year 8. All right. So then we had the derecognition amount as lease liability debit with the derecognition amount of lease liability. We credited ROU asset with the derecognition amount against ROU asset, and the gain on derecognition was a balancing figure. All right. ROU asset derecognition, we calculated it the same way as previous example, wherein we actually took and multiplied it by 40%. We took the carrying amount and multiplied it by 40 percentage, and that was the same way as what we did in the previous example. The only difference was about the derecognition of lease liability. With this, we are actually not done with the example. We are only done with part one of modification accounting. Remember, we broke down the modification accounting over here into two parts, right? Part one was about derecognition. Part two was where we calculated the revised lease liability. We calculated the revised lease liability. If you remember, we calculated the part two as revised lease liability as at year 6, as at the beginning of year 6. All right. How did we calculate the lease liability at the beginning of year 6? We had years which was 1, 2, and 3. 1 represents the payment for year 6. It represents payment for year 6. 2 represents payment for year 7. And 3 basically represents the payment that is going to be made at the end of year 8. The cash flows are actually not changing. As a result of modification, the cash flow is actually going to remain 1,80,000 for all the 3 years. We then have present value factor. We are now going to calculate this at 11 percentage and not at 10 percentage. We're going to calculate the present value factor at 11 percentage, which is the revised discount rate, and we have the discounted cash flow. All right. So we are now calculating the present value of 1,80,000 at 11 percentage discount rate. All right. So for the first year, it's going to be equal to 0.9009. For the second year, it's going to be equal to 0.8116, 0.8116, and for the third year, it's going to be 0.7312. All right, the discounted cash flow will be 1,80,000 multiplied by 0.9009, which is 1,62,162. We then have 1,80,000 multiplied by 0.8116, which is 1,46,088. And for the third year, we have 1,80,000 multiplied by 0.7312, which is going to be 1,31,616. The sum total of all this will be equal to 4,39,866. All right. Remember, I actually told you that the carrying amount of lease liability of 447 is the present value of 1,80,000 discounted at 10 percentage. It's the present value of 1,80,000 discounted at 10 percentage for the next 3 years. We are actually doing literally the same calculation over here. 1,80,000 discounted at 11 percentage is the only difference. All right. Therefore, the cash flows are the same. The cash flows are actually the same. The only difference is the discount rate, and hence you have a very small gap in the revised lease liability and the carrying amount. The carrying amount is 447,649. The carrying amount is 447,649, whereas the revised lease liability is 439,866. The gap is very small, and the gap is only on account of change in discount rate. All right. So here we actually have a decrease in lease liability. In my books, I have a lease liability of 447,649. I need to recognize a lease liability only of 439,866. Therefore, I have got a decrease in lease liability. I have a decrease in lease liability of 447,649. 447,649 less 439,866. It's 4 less 439,866. The difference is going to be equal to 7,783. Why did the lease liability decrease? The lease liability decreased because of the change in discount rate. Earlier in my books, lease liability was recognized at 10% discount rate, but as a result of the modification, I have to revise the lease liability at 11 percentage, and therefore I have a decrease in lease liability of 7,783, and correspondingly, I will actually decrease ROU asset also by 7,783. So the journal entry will be lease liability debit of 7,783, credit ROU asset of 7,783. All right, so we debit lease liability by 7,783 and credit ROU asset by 7,783. So the carrying amount of ROU asset, the final carrying amount of ROU asset after modification. Earlier, we had the carrying amount after 40% derecognition. I'm now calculating the carrying amount after modification. It's going to be equal to 331,808. The carrying amount after derecognition was 331,808. So it's going to be 331,808, 331,808 less 7,783. I'm derecognizing 7,700. So it will be 331,808 less 7,783. That is going to be equal to 3,24,025. So my final value of ROU asset after modification is 324,025. The carrying amount of lease liability, the carrying amount of lease liability after modification is going to be equal to, I had a lease liability after derecognition. Remember, after derecognition, my lease liability was 447,649. It was 447,649. 447,649. I am now derecognizing 7,783. So my revised lease liability is going to be 447,649 minus 7,783, which is going to be equal to 4,39,866. This 439,866 is nothing but my revised lease liability. After my decrease in lease liability after modification, my lease liability in the books will actually be equal to the revised lease liability of 439,866. All right, this ROU asset of 324,025 will be depreciated over a period of 3 years. The remaining lease term is 3 years. Therefore, this 324,025 will be depreciated over a period of 3 years, and we will actually have a revised lease liability schedule based on 439,866 and a discount rate of 11 percentage. We are going to actually have a revised lease liability which is calculated based on this beginning balance of 439,866, and we will have for a period of 3 years interest calculated at 11 percentage. 11 percentage is basically the discount rate that has been used to arrive at this 439,866. Now, with this, we are actually done with change in consideration, where we actually saw an example. The consideration was changing from 1 lakh to 95,000. We also are done with with an increase in lease term. We saw an example where the lease term was increasing from 10 to 14 years. So we are done with increase in lease term. We also were done with a decrease in the scope of lease. All right, where the scope of lease was coming down from 5,000 square feet to 2,500 square feet. So we were done with decrease in scope of lease, and we now did a decrease in lease term as well. We have now done decrease in lease term where we actually saw that the lease term was reducing from 10 to 8 years. All right. There was a slight difference between decrease in lease term and decrease in the scope of lease, wherein we actually did not do lease liability multiplied by 40 percentage in case of a decrease in lease term. In case of a decrease in scope of lease, what we did is we multiplied lease liability with 50 percentage, which was the percentage decrease in the scope of lease. Whereas in case of change in lease term, yes, the lease term came down by 40 percentage. The remaining lease term came down by 40 percentage, but we did not do lease liability multiplied by 40 percentage. We actually separately calculated the derecognition of lease liability. We had to separately calculate the derecognition of lease liability, which we calculated as the present value of the payments that are no longer required to be made. The present value of the payments that are no longer required to be made is actually the derecognition of lease liability. The derecognition of lease liability was the present value of the payments that are no longer required to be made. That 237,702 was nothing but the sum total of 1,80,000 that was payable for year 9 and 1,80,000 that was payable for year 10. All right, that 2,24 was basically the sum of 122 plus 111. Although we are done with this example and we do not really need to actually watch this video ahead, if you have understood what we have done here, I'm only explaining for the sake of understanding why we did not do lease liability multiplied by 40 percentage in this case, whereas we actually did lease liability multiplied by 50 percentage in the previous illustration. Now, if you look at the previous example, we actually entered into a 10-year lease contract for 5,000 square meters, and the payment was 50,000 per annum payable at the end of fifth year. Now, at the beginning of year 6, we are entering into a modification contract where the square meters was reduced from 5,000 to 2,500. Already before the modification, at the end of year 5, before the modification, at the end of year 5 or beginning of year 6, we ideally had to pay 50,000 per annum for the next 5 years. All right, we would have ideally paid 50,000 per annum for the next 5 years. Let us actually plot it. Continuation of illustration 35. If we did not actually have modification, we would have had 5 years of payments, year 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. At the for year 1, it basically is nothing but payment of year 6. This is basically payment of year 6. At the end of year 2, we would have made payment for year 7. We have payment of year 8, payment of year 9, and for the fifth year, it would have been payment of year 10. All right, because we are standing at the end of year 5, we are standing at end of year 5 or beginning of year 6. I have got payment of year 6, which is 1 year away from today, and payment of year 10 is 5 years away from today. I would have had to pay a cash flow of 50,000 for each year. I would have had to pay a 50,000 cash flow for each year. The discount rate that was given in the question was actually 6 percentage. If you remember, the discount rate that was given in the question was actually 6 percentage. We had a discount rate at the commencement of lease as 6 percentage. All this calculation is assuming that modification has not taken place. Let us actually plot the 6% discount factor. It would be equal to 0.9434, 0.8900, 0.8396, 0.7921, and 0.7473. All right, we have present value factors calculated at 6 percentage, and I have discounted cash flow. 50,000 multiplied by 0.9434 is 47,170. 50,000 multiplied by 0.89 is equal to 44,500. And then I have 50,000 multiplied by 0.8396, which is 41,980. And I have 50 multiplied by 0.7921, which is equal to 39,605, and for the fifth year it would be 50,000 multiplied by 0.7473, which is 37,365. If I take the sum total of all this, 47,170 plus 44,500 plus 41,980 plus 39,605 plus 37,365, this is going to be equal to 2,10,620. If you remember, this was actually the carrying amount of the lease liability before I actually did any derecognition or modification. The carrying amount of this lease liability at the end of fifth year or beginning of year 6 was actually equal to 2,10,620. Let me actually bring up that part of the solution on the screen. Here you go. We actually had a 2,10,618 of lease liability at the end of year 5. What did I show you? I'm showing you nothing but the fact that this 2,10,618, which we calculated as the carrying amount at the end of year 5, was nothing but the present value of the lease payments from year 6 to year 10. This is present value of the lease payments from year 6 to year 10 discounted at 6% per annum. All right. What I've actually done over here, if you notice, is I've calculated the present value of all the remaining lease payments of 50,000 from year 6 to year 10. I discounted it at 6% and I got the same 2,10,620. All right, there's a minor difference, which is obviously on account of rounding. Now, we have entered into a modification contract where the space has been reduced from 5,000 square meters to 2,500 square meters. All right, we earlier had a space of 5,000 square meters and we now reduced it to 2,500 square meters. Out of the 5,000 square meters, you are actually now giving up 2,500 square meters. All right, you're giving up 2,500 square meters and you're continuing to use another 2,500 square meters. All right. If the consideration for 5,000 square meters was actually rupees 50,000 per annum, the consideration for 5,000 square feet is actually 50,000 per annum. Ind AS 116 is stating that because you are giving up 2,500, you are now no longer required to pay 25,000. All right. What Ind AS 116 is presuming is because you're giving up 2,500, you are now no longer required to pay 25,000 rupees. That is the presumption that Ind AS 116 is making. All right. The true fact is you are actually now reducing the consideration from 50,000 to 30,000. But so therefore, you're no longer required to pay 20,000. In reality, you're no longer required to pay 20,000. But Ind AS 116 is actually presuming that you are no longer required to pay 25,000. If you are no longer required to pay 25,000, the amount of liability that you no longer are obligated to pay. All right. How did we actually, if you remember in the example that we were doing, we calculated the derecognition of liability as the present value of the payments we are no longer required to pay. The present value of the lease payments that we are no longer required to pay, which was payments for year 4 and 5 or year 9 and 10 is what we were no longer required to pay. And we derecognize that amount. In this case, Ind AS 116 is actually presuming that because 50,000 was the consideration for 5,000 square meters, 25,000 is going to be the consideration for 2,500 square meters that we are giving up. We are giving up 2,500, therefore we are no longer required to pay 25,000. So what Ind AS 116 is actually asking us to do is calculate the present value of the payments that we are no longer required to make, and that is going to be calculated as present value of 25,000, present value of 25,000 that we are no longer required to make for the next 5 years. The present value of 25,000 is something that we are no longer required to make for the next 5 years is what we are actually going to calculate. And if you actually think of it, all these numbers will get halved. All right, 50,000 is going to get halved. 50,000 is going to get halved to calculate 25,000, right? So we multiply every number by 50 percentage. We multiply every number by 50 percentage. If cash flows are being multiplied by 50 percentage, discounted cash flow will also be multiplied by 50 percentage. The discounted cash flow will also get halved. If the discounted cash flow gets halved, this 2,10,000 is also going to get halved. This 2,10,000 will also get halved, and therefore the lease liability derecognition in this case will be exactly equal to carrying amount multiplied by 50 percentage. All right. What Ind AS 116 is presuming is if you are giving up on 2,500 square meters, you are basically no longer required to pay 50 percentage of the current consideration. All right. It's presuming that you're no longer required to pay, make a 50%, you're no longer required to make a payment of 50 percentage of the current amount of consideration. Therefore, everything is going to get halved. When everything gets halved, the amount of derecognition will be exactly equal to lease liability multiplied by 50 percentage. Now, obviously, that assumption is wrong, right? That assumption that we are no longer required to make a payment of 25,000 is wrong. We are actually no longer required to make a payment only of 20,000. All right. We are actually required to make an additional payment of 5,000. If you look at it, I derecognized assuming that I have to pay 25,000. I derecognized 25,000, which means I'm assuming that I have to pay 25,000 in future. All right. After derecognition of 50 percentage, if I derecognize 50% of my carrying amount, what that carrying amount basically would represent is the present value of the 25,000 for the next 5 years. All right. If that one, whatever is the amount that is left after derecognition, that amount will be 210,620 multiplied by 50 percentage. All right. Out of this 210,620, I derecognize 105 and I continue to recognize 105, 310. All right. This is the amount that I'm continuing to recognize on the balance sheet. This 105, 310 is actually nothing but the present value of the lease payments of 25,000 for the next 5 years. This would basically represents present value of the lease payments for year 6 to year 10 discounted at 10 percentage. All right, but this is actually going to be incorrect. This is actually going to be incorrect because I actually have to make a payment of 30,000 for the next 5 years. I am required to make a payment of 30,000 for the next 5 years. My balance sheet has a liability only of 25,000 for the next 5 years. So therefore, revised lease liability was calculated as present value of 30,000 for next 5 years, which is for year 6 to year 10, calculated at a discount rate of 5 percentage. I'm sorry, this is actually not 10 percentage. This is going to be equal to 6 percentage, right? 10 percentage was in my example, 6 percentage was in the institute example. So what we did is we calculated the present value of 30,000 for the next 5 years, which is year 6 to 10 at the rate of 5 percentage. And we got some value over here. I don't exactly remember the amount here. Let me just quickly go and check what that amount was. We had an amount equal to 1,29,885. All right, 30,000 discounted at 5% was equal to 129,885. All right, so my revised lease liability was supposed to be 129,885. And what we did is we recognized the difference between 129 and 105 as the increase. All right, therefore, increase was basically recognized as 129,885 minus 105, 310, which was equal to 24,575. And correspondingly, ROU asset also had this increase. This increase was basically to both ROU asset and lease liability. All right, I'm repeating myself. What Ind AS 116 presumes at the first place is when you are actually paying 50,000 for 5,000 square meters and you're giving up on 2,500, you're basically no longer required to pay 25,000. If you're no longer required to pay 25,000, every number over here gets actually halved. Every number over here is getting halved, and therefore your carrying amount can be directly derecognized by multiplying it with 50%. You multiply that with 50 percentage to calculate the amount of derecognition. 25,000 you no longer have to pay. Therefore, amount of derecognition is directly multiplied as 50 percentage. We are now then going to have a remaining lease liability after 50% derecognition. From 210, we derecognized 50 percentage. Therefore, the remaining lease liability is going to be equal to 105, 310. It will be equal to 105, 310. That 105, 310, if you logically think, it is nothing but the present value of 25,000 that I'm required to pay for the next 5 years. Present value of 25,000 that I'm required to pay for the next 5 years. Out of 50,000, if I've presumed that 25,000 is no longer required to be paid, the remaining 25,000 is required to be paid, and the present value of those 25,000 at 6% will be equal to 105, 310. But this is a wrong presumption because I am actually required to make a payment of 30,000 for the next 5 years. I am required to make a payment of 30,000 for the next 5 years. Therefore, we calculate the present value of 30,000 for the next 5 years, but we are going to use the revised discount rate of 5 percentage, and we arrive at the revised lease liability of 129,885. This is the amount of liability that should exist in the books. 105, 310 is the amount of liability that I have in the books right now. Therefore, I am basically going to calculate the difference as the increase in lease liability of 24,575, and correspondingly, I increase my right of use asset. I'm correspondingly increasing my right of use asset. So what I did is directly multiplied by 50 percentage, worked over here, because at the first place, we are assuming that we are no longer required to make a payment of 25, and therefore we are derecognizing the 50 percentage. But later on, we are correcting that by calculating the revised lease liability of 30,000 for the next 5 years, and we are actually bringing our lease liability to 129,885. This 129,885 is now actually reflecting the true scenario where I'm required to make a payment of 30,000 for the next 5 years. Where in this example, I was able to directly multiply it by 50 percentage to calculate the amount of derecognition of lease liability. For calculating the derecognition of lease liability, Ind AS 116 presumed that I no longer have to pay 25,000. Therefore, I directly multiplied it with 50 percentage. I directly multiplied it with 50 percentage. But in our case, in our example that we did above, we cannot actually directly multiply it by 40 percentage. All right. The percentage reduction in lease term is actually equal to 40 percentage, but I cannot directly multiply it by 40 percentage because over here, the lease payments are actually reducing. If you look at it, the lease payments are actually going to reduce. The lease payments of 1,80,000 are actually reducing. All right. I'm no longer required to make a payment for year 4 and year 5. All right. I cannot do this directly as 40 percentage because in discounted cash flow, these two are actually a different percentage. All right. If I actually calculate 1 lakh, 3,60,000 divided by 1,80,000 multiplied by 5, if I calculate 3,60,000, which is payments that I no longer have to make, 3,60,000 is the payment that I no longer have to make, divided by 1,80,000 multiplied by 5 divided by 9 lakhs. See, I earlier had to make a payment of 1,80,000 for 5 years. 3,60,000 is no longer required to be made. This will actually come to 40 percentage. But the problem is I actually have to derecognize in present value terms because my carrying amount is in present value terms. I have to derecognize the amounts in present value terms, and in present value terms, 122 and 111 are not 40 percentage of the discounted cash flow. All right, 122 plus 111 will not be equal to 40% of discounted cash flow. The proportion will obviously be different. In case of a decrease in the scope of lease, what happened is the cash flows were presumed to exactly reduce by 50 percentage. 50,000 cash flow we presumed will exactly reduce by 50 percentage. Over here, I cannot make that presumption. All right, because over here, although in the pure cash flow terms, I no longer have to pay 40 percentage. In present value terms, that is actually not going to be equal to 40 percentage. 122 plus 111 will actually be slightly different from 40 percentage. As a percentage of 682, it's going to be different. All right. Therefore, in that case, I was able to directly multiply 50 percentage to calculate the derecognition of lease liability. Whereas over here, I cannot do a direct multiplication of 40 percentage. That was basically a shortcut of derecognition. The actual way of calculating the derecognition amount is basically over here as what we learned in this example itself. All right. So we cannot do multiplied by 40 percentage to calculate the derecognition amount in this particular case. Even if you have not understood, don't worry. All you need to remember is in case of decrease in scope of lease, you can directly multiply the percentage decrease in the scope of lease to calculate the derecognition of lease liability. Whereas in this case, you cannot directly do that. What you need to do is you have to calculate the present value of the lease payments that you no longer have to make. 1,80,000 you no longer have to make for years 9 and 10. 1,80,000 you no longer have to make for year 9 and 10. Therefore, you can derecognize 122 plus 111 from your carrying amount. Your carrying amount before the derecognition was actually equal to 682,351, and we reduced it by 234,702 to calculate 4,47,649. After this, we again calculate revised lease liability. We calculated revised lease liability just like in the previous illustration. The difference is that lease liability is going to actually have the discount rate of 11 percentage, which is today's discount discount rate, and then I actually calculate the change in lease liability with a corresponding effect to ROU asset. All right, we calculate it with a corresponding effect to the ROU asset. With this, we are done with the four branches that we saw over here: change in consideration, change in lease term, increase and decrease of lease term, and decrease in the scope of lease. Thank you.